Alrighty then. Let's see how well this thing works. The picture isn't great. Hey, at least what I'm looking at, it isn't great. There we go. You can at least see my face now a bit. I don't know if that's a good thing or not, but you're going to see my face whether you want to or not, I guess. It's funny. I've over the years, I've done quite a bit of reading on the topic of capital punishment and the history of capital punishment and so on. I found it interesting. I'm hoping my voice is being picked up by this machine right now. I'm using the tablet to record this, so it's hit and miss with the tablet. But anyway, and there's an interesting story, and it came out only a few years ago. At least the full story only came out a few years ago. And it's the story of the last judicial hangings in Canada, which took place in 1962. I believe it was December the 11th. It was a Tuesday in 1962. I'm pretty sure it was December. It might have been November, but I think it was December. Anyway, it was a Tuesday, and it was in 1962, and it was the 11th of the month it happened in, and it was either November or December. I believe December. They often used to do executions prior to Christmas in order to get the population on death row down to zero or down to a minimal number, so that the guards at the Don Jail in Toronto, where they had death row at that time, so the guards could be home at Christmas time. So they often would try to clean out death row and kill as many of them as they could prior to Christmas, so that they didn't have to have extra staff on at Christmas time. Anyway, it's kind of cold, but that's the reality of the situation, you know. The last two executed, it was actually a double execution. They were dropped together, because we use hanging here. The long drop method is what we used here. We hung people. And the first man was a black man from Detroit. He was actually an American citizen. And his name, oh, isn't that awful? See now, isn't that awful? I wasn't trying to think of it. Oh gosh. Okay, well, the second man was a fellow by the name of Ronald Turpin, and he was a 29-year-old man from Toronto. And I'm trying to remember the other guy's name now. And isn't this awful? I'll tell you, there's something going on with my memory. As soon as I went to say it, it left me. He was a black man from Detroit. He was a career criminal. The first guy I'm talking about he was 54 years old. And he had been a pimp and a drug dealer and different things like that all his life. And he was blamed for killing an FBI witness that was part of a big trial that the U.S. government was hiding up here in Canada. They were concerned for the witness's safety, so they hid the witness up here. The witness's girlfriend was with him, and this fella was blamed for killing both of them. It was considered to be a contract hit, and they said that he'd come up here from Detroit and murdered these two people, and then had gone back across the line into Detroit. Now, the case against him was very flimsy. There was no real evidence against him. He denied that he did it. Of course he would. Anyway, even if he was guilty, he'd probably deny it to try to save his own neck. But he did, just for the record, he did deny it. And the case against him was flimsy. And many legal experts over the years have said that he should never have been convicted with the case they had. But unfortunately, his lawyer was a very brilliant lawyer. He considered have a very brilliant legal mind, but he was also a severe alcoholic. And he wasn't even there for large portions of the trial. He just didn't show up. And so the trial basically went on without the defense lawyer even being present for most of it. And he was, and when he was there, he wasn't in the best of shape because he was either impaired or he was sick, from being impaired. And so he wasn't a whole lot of use anyway. And my goodness, why can't I think of that fella's name? I've got to think of his name. Okay, well, isn't this awful? Well, hold on. I want to get the other phone. Arthur Lucas. There you go. I don't have to get the other phone. Arthur Lucas is the man's name, the black man from Detroit who they hanged in 1962 at the Don Jail in Toronto. The other man who was hanged with him was 29-year-old Ronald Turpin. And Ronald Turpin's story is a little different in that there was no doubt about Ronald Turpin's guilt. He had indeed done what he was accused of doing, and there was no questioning it. And Ronald Turpin was also a career criminal. And what he had done is he committed an armed robbery. I've heard alternately that it was a supermarket or a restaurant. I don't know which it was, if he robbed the supermarket or a restaurant, but it was an armed robbery. He got pulled over by a Toronto City police officer because he was driving a panel truck and he had a burned out taillight. And he was pulled over for the taillight. Now, that cop knew nothing about the robbery. But Turpin didn't know that and thought he was being pulled over for the robbery. And he was afraid, because that's kind of a serious charge. He didn't want to go to prison. And so what did he do? But he shot the cop that pulled him over, shot him dead. And then he abandoned his panel truck and he got into the patrol car and he stole the patrol car. Well, of course, there were witnesses, because this was right in metropolitan Toronto, so there was always witnesses. And he didn't get very far anyway before he got boxed in, and he got caught. And so he was the other fellow who was hanged that day in 1962. Now, here's the story. He also had the same lawyer, too, as Arthur Lucas. That same lawyer represented both of them. And although he was highly regarded and very well respected for his legal abilities, he was so badly crippled by alcoholism that he was next to useless as a defense lawyer, even though he was bright and had a lot of potential. Now, he ended up drinking himself to death. That case actually, those two cases actually finished him. They took such an emotional toll on him that it just finished him, and he ended up dying from alcohol-related complications. A few years later, back in the late 70s or early 80s, I'm not sure exactly when, but it'd be around 45 years ago now that he passed away, and it was due to alcohol. And people who knew him said that his alcoholism got a lot worse. It was bad before, but it got a lot worse because of those cases. Anyway, so he was kind of a casualty in the whole thing too, Anyway, Arthur Lucas, he accepted that he was going to be hanged. He denied that he did what he was being hanged for. But basically what he said is, well, all the bad stuff I've done over the course of my life is coming back on me. I didn't do what they're going to hang me for, but I did plenty of other things over the years. So I guess this is karma, basically. This is my karma coming back on me. And that's how he looked at it. They befriended the Salvation Army chaplain who would visit the jail. He'd come and he'd play checkers with them, and he'd counsel them and visit with them. He came every day to the jail to see them. Spent a few hours with them every day, and they got to be good friends. And he was a witness to the executions. Now, he told this story on his deathbed. He had been threatened, and he was afraid to tell the story beforehand. The official story was that the hangman went off without a hitch, and it was just a very professional job, and there was no issues. That wasn't true, and he did tell the proper story on his deathbed. It turns out, when they brought Turpin and Lucas into the death chamber, which actually was a converted washroom. It had been a washroom in the jail, and they converted it into a hanging room, basically, with a trap door that you'd fall down into the room below. You know, when they brought Turpin and Lucas in there, Turpin saw the two nooses hanging there, one for him and one for Lucas, and he fainted. He went unconscious. Now, they say his heart might have stopped even from fright, and he might have been dead. They didn't really check him too closely, but either he was unconscious or dead. More likely he was unconscious, really, but anyway, he never regained consciousness. They propped him up with broom handles stuffed up inside his shirt in order to keep him upright, where they got the noose around his neck and everything. Turpin was, Lucas, on the other hand, was conscious throughout the procedure. Now, when they dropped the two of them, when the floor dropped out from under them, of course, they fell down into the room below with the nooses around their necks. Arthur Lucas had syphilis, which was a common thing. You can imagine a pimp, he would be trying out the girls and everything, and, be like a kid in a candy store, I suppose, with all these different girls. And so it wasn't uncommon that they contract diseases like syphilis. Al Capone actually had syphilis, and he was a pimp when he was a teenager, and he had syphilis from that. Anyway, Arthur Lucas did have syphilis, and it had weakened all the connective tissues in his body. And so when they dropped him, he was partially decapitated. Apparently there was blood spurting out all over the place. The doctor down there had to climb a ladder and, check both men with the stethoscope, see if their hearts were still beating. And the doctor was just drenched, just covered from head to toe in Arthur Lucas's blood, It was all over the walls and everything. And anyway, after the two men had expired, they were taken to a cemetery in Toronto, and they were each buried in unmarked graves. The Salvation Army chaplain knew the location of the graves because he had gone with them to say prayers over the graves as they were being laid to rest. But it's not generally known to the public where those graves actually are. And they're just an unmarked grave in Potter's Field, basically, in a Toronto cemetery. But that's the story, anyway, of the last judicial hanging in Canada. One thing that was kind of funny, I guess you could call it gallows humor, is when Arthur Lucas was told that he and Turpin would most likely be the last two to be executed in Canada. Got a beautiful, just landed on my hand, a beautiful blue dragonfly. But then it took off again. But when Arthur Lucas was told that he and Turpin would most likely be the last two to face the noose in Canada, he just shrugged his shoulders and he said, "Some consolation." That's all he said, just some consolation, But they come close to doing another execution in 1974 of a fellow by the name of Rene Vallencourt. And I remember that. I remember the night that he was supposed to be executed. He got a last-minute reprieve. And then by the time his case had gone through the courts and so on, the death penalty had been abolished in Canada. That occurred in 1976. So his case was still going through the courts because of the reprieve. He got a reprieve because there were some issues with his case that had to be sorted out. And that's how he got his reprieve, and then they did away with it before they got around to hanging him anyway. But I remember that day. I remember listening to it on the old AM radio, listening to it and seeing it on the news too, on the 6 o'clock news. They showed pictures of them taking him down into a underground garage in the Ford Falcon car. And there were reporters running along beside the car, slapping the side of the car and yelling because they wanted him to look up. He was looking down, and they wanted him to look up so they could get his picture. They had the cameras up there, these big cameras they used to have. Anyway, Yeah, and I remember an interview with the prison superintendent, with the jail superintendent, where a reporter asked the jail superintendent, he said, "So, do you think Vallencourt's going to swing tonight?" I remember that too, you know. Anyway, he didn't swing. I don't know if he's still alive or not. He'd be quite old if he is. But he didn't swing. He might still be in prison. I just don't know what became of him after that. I just know there were issues with his case, and that earned him an appeal. And then I don't know what happened after that. I know we abolished the noose in Canada in 1976, and they hadn't gotten around to doing anything with him by the time that happened. So he was at least spared that. But his story was he had robbed a Bank of Commerce, and he'd gotten away in a 1965 Pontiac Parisienne that he had stolen. He had his own car parked on a blocks away on a side street, and his plan was to abandon the 65 Pontiac and to get into his own car and leave. That way he wouldn't be driving the stolen Pontiac he used for the robbery. Make it harder to catch up with him, you know, because they'd be looking for a 65 Pontiac. When he went to park the 65 Pontiac on a side street, and then he was going to go over to another side street where his car was, but a cop spotted him, and I guess they put an APB out on that type of a car that he was getting out of, and he matched the description. And he ended up getting into a foot chase with that cop, and he ended up shooting the cop anyway, and that's why he was on death row. But yeah, anyway, Canada's got quite a checkered past, you know. Oh, another thing, the hangman at that time, the official hangman of Canada at that time, was a fellow by the name of Camille Vallencourt. Now, he's dead now, so his name has come out. That was kept secret back then. They used to call him by the name Ellis. All the hangmen in Canada went by the pseudonym of Ellis back then. Ellis. But his real name was Camille Blanchard, and he was the manager of a trailer park in Napanee, Ontario. And from what I understand, none of the tenants in that trailer park ever acted up, and they all paid their rent on time too. Well, I'm just kidding. I don't know that, but I just think that's kind of a funny thought. If you knew the hangman was your landlord, I bet you'd be on your best behavior, you know. Anyway, I'm sure they didn't know though, because that was the whole idea. His identity was to be kept secret. But apparently that was his name, and he was Camille Blanchard, and he was a manager of a trailer park in Napanee, Ontario, which is actually just west of Kingston, Ontario. And he was kind of a short, stout man, apparently. And when he would go to a hanging, he'd wear a black suit. He didn't wear a hood over his head or whatever. And somebody did interview him one time, and he said that his job was to hang the man, not to scare him to death. You know, so that's why he didn't wear the stereotypical thing you see in the movies and so on of the executioner with the black hood over his head and stuff. Anyway, that's the story. It's a little macabre, but that did happen. That's part of our history here in Canada. And I'm kind of a history buff. Plus, I have always been interested in capital punishment. And so I accumulated some knowledge on that subject. And that's the story anyway. And for many years, the real story of that last hanging was covered up. But the Salvation Army chaplain did tell the real story on his deathbed. He was afraid to tell it before then because he'd been threatened. Anyway, we'll talk to you later.